Hey, Macarian Rising here. This next set of videos are going to bring us to the conclusion of the overview of the core rules for BuffDis 2141, and we're going to focus on buff tokens, their effects, and timer dice. Enjoy! To activate a buff token during the game, a player must end its model's action within 1 inch of the buff token. So this could mean that the model has moved and ended its move action. It could mean that the model was already next to the buff token and readied as a final action, or it could be that the player was next to the player's model was next to the buff token and they decided to attack another model, perform a combat. Each one of those results in an action being ended, and so the buff token is then activated. Once the buff token has been activated, the player who controls the model which activated the buff token removes the buff token from the board. They then get to choose which buff zone the buff token goes into, and there's a corresponding buff zone under each stat. So you could place it in agility, or range, or energy, etc., etc. Important note is that once buff tokens have been placed, for example in energy, that buff token can't be removed by the player. Equally, buff tokens don't stack, so it's 1 buff token per buff zone. Now we will review the buff token impact on stats. Strike stat increase. When increasing the strike stat, you will add the number to the model's strike rolls. So, for example, I enter a combat, I perform a strike roll, and I roll a 14. Say I have a 2 on my strike stat, in my buff zone of my strike stat. That means I will add 2 to the 14, giving me a total number of 16. Condition stat increase. When a buff token is in the buff zone of the condition stat, at the start of every round, the model's condition points will increase by a number indicated by the buff token up to a maximum of 12. If you have a buff token value 2, then at the beginning of every round, your condition points will tick up by 1. If you have a buff token 3, it will tick up by 2. And if you have a buff token 4, it will tick up by 3 condition points. So, for example, we can see here that the model has 9 condition points as indicated by the D12 being face up on the number 9. And we can see that we've got a buff token valued 4 in the buff zone of the condition stat. This means at the beginning of the next turn, we will be able to tick up our condition points back up to 12, which means we've regained full health. Agility stat increase, again, very similar to the strike stat increase. So this means whenever you're doing a dodge roll or making an agility test, you're basically adding the number that's on the buff token placed in the buff zone underneath the agility stat. So in this instance here, I would have a total of 15, inclusive of the dice roll and the buff token value. For the range stat and energy stat increases, exactly the same. Range is how far a target can be away from you and still be valid, and energy is how far you can move. Both are made in inches. And for the example here, we could see that our range has extended from 4 inches to 6 inches because we have a buff token 2. And our allocated movement range or distance is extended from 6 inches to 9 inches because we have a 3 valued buff token. If we swap them around, our range would now be 7 and our energy would be 8. Damage stat increase. So when performing a damage roll, if you have no buff tokens in the buff zone of your damage stat, you're rolling 1d6. If you have a buff token valued 2 in the buff zone of your damage stat, you're rolling 2d6 and selecting the highest. It's a good roll. If you have a 3, then you're rolling 3d6 and selecting the highest. And if you have a 4, then obviously you're rolling 4d6 and selecting the highest. So, as previously described, once a model has ended an action within 1 inch of a buff token, that buff token is activated, removed from the board, and placed on the buff zone on the model card. This buff token now needs to be replaced by a timer dice. Timer dice are used to indicate how many round ends must pass before a new buff token can be returned to the board in place of the buff token which was just activated. As an example, a buff token has been activated and removed from the board. The player then rolls a d6 timer dice and puts it in place of the buff token with the number rolled facing up. The number rolled on the d6 in this instance is a 5. This indicates that 5 round ends must pass before the timer dice is replaced with a new buff token. At the beginning of each game round, the timer dice on the board will tick down. And this means you will rotate the dice so that the number now facing up is 1 lower. So here we went from 5 to 4. Once the timer dice, which is on 1, reaches the beginning of a game round, it is replaced with a new buff token from the buff token pool. Once the buff pool has been depleted of buff tokens, no more buff tokens can be added to the board. Equally, if there are any remaining timer dice, these should be removed.